Good morning. I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for the Washington Post. Welcome to First Look, Washington Post Live's one-stop shop for news and analysis. And if it's Friday and the other person on the screen is Dan Balz, then you know it's a good morning. Dan Balz, chief political correspondent of the Washington Post. Good morning, Dan. Welcome back.
Good morning, Jonathan. How are you today?
I am fine. I am fine. We have some serious stuff to talk about, Dan. Yesterday, there was a mass shooting in Texas, and it came hours after President Biden in the Rose Garden announced a number of executive actions on guns. What's he hoping for from Congress?
Well, I think he's hoping, obviously, for some action from Congress. This is an issue that, he goes way back on. And you could see in his demeanor yesterday and in his language that this is an issue about which he has great passion. He's had success on this issue back when he was a senator in passing the assault weapons ban. He's had lack of success when he was vice president and tried to push with President Obama a package of gun control measures after the Sandy Hook shootings, and they were not able to get that through. He did what he was able to do yesterday, which is obviously limited in executive actions, but he's going to try to continue to press Congress for action. I want to make one other point on the executive actions. When he was vice president, he and President Obama issued about 24 executive actions, and I think that we have to recognize that they have limited effect. They can work at the margins, but he really needs legislation to do the kinds of things that he believes need to be done.
Dan, let's have some real talk here about what Congress could do. Because you just mentioned during the Obama-Biden administration, they tried actions on guns. Sandy Hook happened while they were in the White House. There was I think it was Toomey Mansion, were trying to get something through in response. It failed. So why should we think that Republicans in particular, because Biden needs the votes in order for it to clear the Senate, what makes this time different? Or is it not different?
I don't know that it is different. I mean, we go through these spasms of reaction to these terrible, horrific shootings, and people look to Congress to act, and Congress, in the end, is not able to act for the most part. I mean, there have been some moments when they did take action, but after Sandy Hook, I think that people thought that there was such a reaction to that terrible set of shootings that this would spur the Congress to act. In the end, the power of the National Rifle Association weighed, more strongly on members of Congress, particularly Republicans, obviously, than did the public opinion polling that showed that the kinds of measures that we're seeking, universal background checks, et cetera, enjoyed wide support. So the question today is, has anything changed? One thing we know that has changed is that the NRA has been through a very bad period. The NRA is not, in many ways, the same organization that it was when we've gone through these battles before. I don't know whether that has any material effect on how Republicans in the House and Senate would respond to new legislation, but I think that's one difference that we've got, and the other obviously is it's just one after another of these shootings that begin to take their toll on the body politic, and maybe that is a spur to action, but I'm not necessarily confident that that's the case.
Right. The president was in the Rose Garden yesterday, being pushed there by two mass shootings that happened within 8 days of each other. I'm talking about Boulder and Atlanta. You mentioned that gun safety measures enjoy popular support. Something else that enjoys popular support: infrastructure. The president's $2.3 trillion infrastructure plan, really it's called the American Jobs Plan, is wending its way through. The president said he's open to compromising with Republicans on how to pay for it. But again, like with guns, is bipartisan cooperation even possible on this?
We'll see. I think that we know that on the basic questions of rebuilding roads, bridges, critical infrastructure, that there has been over many years bipartisan support to take action on that. Obviously, what the president has proposed goes well beyond some of those traditional definitions of infrastructure. It's a quite expansive definition of it, though he makes the case that these are as vitally important as some of the issues of building roads and bridges. Um, I think that the president will seek some kind of bipartisan cooperation. I suspect he will do meetings with members of both sides to get ideas and to see what is possible. But what we have seen so far this year in terms of the recently passed stimulus package is that in the end, there wasn't any Republican who was prepared to really make a deal with the president on terms that the president was willing to make. I mean, there was that counter proposal that the Republicans made on the stimulus package, which was barely a third the size of what the president was talking about. And I think that the president took that as a sign that they were not serious about trying to negotiate. We'll see what's different about this. I mean, there's so many pieces of this. The president, as with the stimulus package, says this is a package, that this you can't start breaking it up and doing things. So there will be debates about how much is in it, and then there obviously, as you said, there will be serious debate about how to pay for it. And we are already seeing some of those lines drawn, but there could be room for some compromise on that as well.
We spend a lot of time talking about Republicans and bringing Republicans along. But actually, the real issue might be someone within the president's own party, and that is West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin, who on our op-ed page laid down a definitive marker. He's against killing the filibuster, against reforming the filibuster, and even doesn't like going along with reconciliation. So having put all of that down on paper and his willingness to work with Republicans to get stuff done, what does that mean for President Biden's agenda?
Well, it's obviously a serious obstacle. And that op-ed that he wrote was, as you say, quite definitive, particularly on the filibuster. In some conversations that I've had over the past day or so, there are people who know Manchin who don't believe that what he has said about reconciliation is a hard and fast opposition to the use of reconciliation. They think that he didn't completely close the door in the way that he did on the filibuster. Well, we'll see on that. The message of that op-ed, Jonathan, was a plea for an effort to work in a bipartisan way, for conversations to go back and forth between Republicans and Democrats, and for the president to be actively engaged in that. Now, the question is, if that takes place, and I suspect that we will see some of that on the infrastructure package, does it lead to anything productive, or do we end up, at the same, gridlocked position that we've had in the past on these issues? And I think that at that moment, then Senator Manchin will have to, kind of have a reckoning with himself about what he wants to do about going forward or not going forward. And I think that's the major question. Once we get through the process that he wants to have happen, does it produce anything? And if it doesn't, what does he do?
Well, and that's the question I have is what Senator Manchin's talking about, is that a fool's errand, given that the Senate Minority Leader has already come out and said, I'm not voting for Biden's infrastructure plan. You have an entire party, the Republican Party, that seems to be in lockstep in opposition to anything President Biden wants to do. And then you throw on top of it, particularly when it comes to the House, a party that was willing to overturn the results of the election. Basically, can the two parties negotiate in good faith?
We haven't seen any evidence that they are able to do that on these big issues. Certainly, this happens on minor legislation all the time. I mean, I'm sure your inbox is flooded with the same kinds of messages that I get. Senator X and Senator Y, one a Democrat, one a Republican, introduce legislation to do Z. But on these big issues, you're right. We've seen no evidence of that. I think that I think we have to take Senator Manchin at his word that he is serious about his desire to have these kinds of things done in a bipartisan way. I think he's correct that the more you can get bipartisan support for these big issues, the better it is for the country as a whole. More people will buy into it, and I think that that's what he's seeking. But as you say, there's very little evidence at this point that the Republicans are prepared to negotiate seriously with the president, and it's not clear, frankly, that the president is willing to give much ground. In the first battle of the year over the stimulus package, he held firm. He got basically the entire package that he sent forward, and perhaps to his surprise, I mean, I'm not sure that the White House even anticipated that they would end up with a totally unified Democratic caucus in the Senate to put through a $1.9 trillion package. So I think this will be a longer process. The stimulus package needed to move quickly because it had to do with COVID and in part, and because certain benefits were about to expire. That's not the case with the infrastructure package. The House has said that they're looking to, Speaker Pelosi has said she's looking to have this done around the 4th of July, thereabouts. That's several months. Then it would go to the Senate. So there's a long time to run on this, and I think it gives people the opportunity to kind of test the boundaries of whether there is any appetite for bipartisanship.
Well, I look forward to seeing what Senator Manchin can accomplish, if anything. Dan, as always, we get up to full gallop and then we've run out of time. Dan Balz, thank you very much for coming back to First Look.
Thank you, Jonathan.
And now let's go to the opinion side of the Washington Post, where we will find columnists Donna Edwards and George Will. Sorry, I got them mixed up. Columnist George Will and former Congresswoman from Maryland and columnist Donna Edwards. Thank you both very much for coming back to First Look.
Glad to be with you.
Thank you.
So,
good to be with you.
So I want to start with both of you, and on guns. The president announced a series of executive actions yesterday. Donna, I will start with you. Do they go far enough?
Well, I look at this and think, well, maybe they go as far as they can go. I think Dan Balz is right that, there's only so much that you can do with executive action. And I think the president, sort of went on the runway yesterday, but he also really indicated that there is action that must take place in the Congress in order to give the kind of relief that the American people clearly have expressed an interest for, a desire for, and at the same time to make sure that we don't have more Pulse shootings, Parkland, Newtown, Mother Emanuel. I mean, the list just goes on and on, plus the two really tragic shootings that happened, mass shootings that happened just before the president's announcement. And so we'll see where this goes.
And George, do they go too far?
I don't think so. After each of these horrific events, there's a flurry of activity about gun control. And people, sensible people, ask, well, would the measures you're proposing have addressed the proximate cause of the proposal, the most recent gun episode? And that's the difficulty, is to establish credibly that this is an enforceable, real response to the problem. During the Democratic nomination scramble in 2020, during one of the debates, someone on stage listed all the number of executive actions she was going to take as president to address gun control, to which former Vice President Biden said, let's be constitutional. We've got a constitution. We shouldn't do this by executive fiat. We should do it through Congress. Well, it's an old saying in politics that where you stand depends on where you sit. And he now sits in the Oval Office, and executive actions are just fine. But again, connecting these executive actions with the difficulties that have provoked them is problematic.
George, let me stick with you on this, because I'm wondering if there are any gun access restrictions or gun safety measures you think Republicans would support.
I don't know. Dan Balz mentioned that the NRA is a shell of its former self. At least it is financially. But I don't. The NRA isn't the problem. It's voters who support the NRA who are the problem, and there are lots of them who are or can be made into single-issue voters on gun control. So again, if you can establish for moderate, sensible Americans the connection between the event and the law, I think it could happen. But establishing that connection is really difficult.
Let's move on to the American Jobs Plan, aka the infrastructure plan. It's $2.3 trillion. It needs 10 Republicans in the Senate to overcome a filibuster. Again, this is a jump ball for both of you, but I will start with you, former member of Congress Donna Edwards. Where are those 10 Republican votes going to come from? Or better yet, are there even 10 votes to overcome that filibuster? Will they even play ball?
Well, so I think the best news that we've had throughout the week is the multiple ways and through multiple administration officials that we have heard that this is up for negotiation. The president has said it, the vice president has said it, any number of his secretaries have said the same thing. And I suspect that over the course of the next couple of months, there's going to be a lot of horse trading. Is it going to be 2.3 trillion at the end? I think it's actually a really great, solid, bold proposal, but I don't know where that's going to end up. I suspect they're going to be shaving here and there and figuring out the pay-fors, and this is going to be done. I think it's exactly the kind of measure. I served on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee in Congress, and it's exactly the kind of proposal where you can look to a senator or a member of the House and say, what is it that you need in your state? And we know that the states have horrible ratings. I think the American Society of Civil Engineers has given the nation a C-, but a state like West Virginia has a D-, I think, for its roads and some of its bridges and things. So there's a lot of deal making to be done before we get to a package that's going to pass the Senate and get those 10 votes that you described.
George, are there 10 votes in the Senate?
Well, there are 10 votes in the Senate for bridges and roads and harbors and airports, but now the word infrastructure obviously polls well. Therefore, everything that anybody wants is now called infrastructure. Free community college, check, infrastructure. Greener school meals, call it infrastructure. So infrastructure has become a distinction without a difference. You sweep everything into it. Part of the kabuki dance that we do in Washington is that every so often we have an infrastructure week or an infrastructure month, and they go to the American Society of Civil Engineers. And they say, well, we've thought about this hard, and what the country ought to do is spend a whole lot more money than it is currently spending on civil engineers. Of course, they're going to say that we have difficulties with our infrastructure, but as Post columnist Chuck Lane said in a column, I guess yesterday, you can't say infrastructure any longer without attaching the adjective crumbling. And it turns out it's not quite as bad as as those who have a vested interest in making it seem as though it's crumbling say it is.
We spent a lot of time, I spent a lot of time asking questions about Republicans, where the Republican vote's going to come from, how you're going to negotiate with them. But quite honestly, the president is going to have a time of it with his own party, with the Democrats on the Hill. On the House side, the Democratic majority has shrunk even more, from folks going into the administration to the passing of Congressman Hastings this week. So the majority in the House is narrow. The majority in the Senate, Democratic majority, depends on the vice president being in the room to break the tie. So Donna, do you think that the president should be as worried about Democrats as he is about Republicans in getting not only the infrastructure bill passed, but any piece of his agenda.
Well, and let's stick with infrastructure. And by the way, George, my mother was a civil engineer, and so I do have a heart for civil engineers. But I think that, on the House side, they actually changed the rules around congressionally directed projects or earmarks, which I think gives the leadership at least some latitude to be able to move members in the right direction on this on the House side. The Senate is a different question. And I have to say, while I agree that Senator Manchin is trying to figure out a way to, make sure that it's these are bipartisan pieces of legislation, et cetera, I think he needs to tread really carefully, because he's going to run the risk that he looks more like an obstructionist than he does somebody who's trying to find consensus. And so I think that's a caution. And of course, there are some Democrats who are hiding behind Senator Manchin because they love it that he's the face of the Democratic sort of pseudo opposition in the Senate. But I would suspect that as we started out with the COVID relief package, that Democrats were not all on the same page there initially, but they got to yes eventually. And I suspect the same thing will happen, at least with infrastructure. I'm not sure what's going to go on with the filibuster, but the use of reconciliation is going to be a card that Democrats are willing to play in the Senate if Republicans just stonewall moving forward, at least the infrastructure legislation.
And George, you're the perfect person to talk about filibuster, reconciliation, what Joe Manchin is up to. I would love your thoughts on Senator Manchin's op-ed saying, I don't want to reform the filibuster. I'm not killing your filibuster. I don't like reconciliation. I think we need to go back to regular order. Do you think Senator Manchin is being realistic in the way that things have been working in Washington of late?
It's a curious locution, regular order, because no one can remember the last time we had regular order. So how regular is it? I don't know, Donna, do you remember regular order in Congress?
You know what? In the 10 years I served, we never had regular order. So everybody called for it, but we never had it.
Hey, Jonathan, don't hold your breath. I credit Senator Manchin's sincerity. I mean, Lord knows he's probably enjoying being in the catbird seat here and being the intersection of all the arguments currently. But let's assume that he means what he says, that he has concerns about the Senate as an institution. And as long as he and Senator Sinema from Arizona hold on to their opposition to filibuster reform, it's not going to be changed. And his op-ed was very categorical, because he wasn't really saying, well, let's go to a talking filibuster where you can't go on to other business in the Senate, so you really do gum up the works and spread the pain. A filibuster is like a strike, or it used to be like a labor strike. It was a test of the pain thresholds of labor and management. The pain has largely been taken out of the filibuster because Mike Mansfield, back in ancient history here, since 1972, said during a filibuster, the Senate can proceed to other business, the two-track system. And that took the pain out of the filibuster and, surprise, surprise, produced a proliferation of filibusters. But I credit Manchin, and I think he's been really categorical and clear. So I think they're going to have to work around it. Now, one way you work around it is by having repeated resorts to reconciliation. And just as the term infrastructure is, to say in a more open textured and elastic, you can make reconciliation very elastic by saying, well, we're just going to pretend that everything we want to do is related to the budget in the way that reconciliation is supposed to.
So I have a question for each of you, specifically for each of you, and we've got 5 minutes, and they're big topics. I'm going to start with you, George, and that is, everyone knows not only you are a terrific political analyst mind, but you also love baseball. So I would love your thoughts, reaction to Major League Baseball moving the All-Star game from Atlanta to Colorado because of the Georgia voting law.
Well, the problem is that Major League Baseball is played in 17 states. And some of those states have restrictions on voting or regulations on voting that are more restrictive than some in Georgia. So first of all, Major League Baseball put itself in a dilemma. Colorado, by the way, is one of those states. Second, Major League Baseball had a problem, and that is the players were agitated about what they had read about. Few had, of course, read the law itself, but what they had read about the Georgia voting restrictions. And it was going to be difficult to get the players to come to Georgia. Whether that's fair to Georgia or not, I don't care about that. That's just what Commissioner Manfred had to deal with. It would, I think, have been better if Commissioner Manfred had said the players are the ones who are driving this. The Players Association should make a decision on this. Instead, he made it. And it looks awkward. And now Major League Baseball is, I'm afraid, hostage to every year when it comes to the All-Star game in one of those 17 states, some group with a grievance about something that has been done or they think should be done. They're going to say Major League Baseball shouldn't come here unless or until the following conditions are met. So yet another portion of American life is now soggy with politics, and I think that's regrettable.
And Donna, the question for you has to do with the Derek Chauvin trial. I know you have been watching. I have been watching sort of with my hands like this because the video keeps playing and playing and playing. But the specific question for you is about the blue wall of silence, and that's the term for police officers never testifying against one another, standing lockstep with each other no matter what. Over this past week, we have seen that crumble a bit with police officer after police officer after police officer taking the stand against Derek Chauvin. Your thoughts on what you've seen in the trial this week?
Well, I agree with you, Jonathan. This has actually been so difficult to watch and to hear the testimony moving from the personal and eyewitnesses, the lay people, to the police officers. And what's been interesting to me, it's not just any police officers. It's the head of training, the chief of police testifying. And I think that must have a tremendous impact on the jury, because it had an impact on me sitting and watching and listening to that testimony. I don't think that this is any kind of breakthrough in terms of what we might see around the country, but it certainly is poignant given the circumstances in Minneapolis. And I think very, very effective testimony building one to the other in terms of laying out how Derek Chauvin's actions were really not in line with training, with practice, with anything that has to do with a lawful arrest of a person. And I think it's been very impactful.
One of the things I'm looking for, I think the prosecution has done an amazing job of presenting the case against Derek Chauvin. I think there have been some interesting moments for Mr. Nelson, Derek Chauvin's defense attorney, in trying to chip away. After the prosecution wraps, I'm looking forward to Nelson presenting his side of the case, because I'm just curious, how do you defend your client against the case that we have seen being argued over the last 2 weeks? Donna.
Well, we've seen a preview of that in Nelson's cross-examination of all of the witnesses throughout this trial. And I think the preview of that is continuing to attack George Floyd's character, to continue to portray him as a drug abuser who didn't die from the knee on his neck, and now we know the pressure on his back. but died from drugs that he may have ingested, even in small amounts. I think it was actually really artful for the prosecution to lay out testimony that would mitigate what they know is coming in the defense. But what else does Derek Chauvin have other than that? Because the jurors can see with their own eyes over and over again. They can hear the expert testimony and they evaluate that. And I think that they'll come to the right conclusion that Derek Chauvin is guilty. And we'll just see. But I don't think there are a lot of legs that Nelson can present that Derek Chauvin has to stand on.
And another strategy Nelson is using is portraying the crowd as being overly hostile, the crowd being a handful of people, including a 9-year-old, a then 17-year-old. We have gone overtime, actually, as we always do, it seems, on Friday, because we get into great discussions. George Will, Donna Edwards, thank you very, very much for coming back to First Look. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
too. Thanks.
And as always, thank you for tuning in. I'll be back at 11 a.m. Eastern today when Kevin Washington, President and CEO of YMCA of the USA, and Clarence Anthony, CEO and Executive Director of the National League of Cities, will be here for a discussion on building trust in vaccines in the Black community. Also, join me tonight for Brooks and Capehart on the PBS NewsHour. Check your local listings. And then on Sunday at 10 a.m. Eastern for the Sunday Show on MSNBC. Once again, I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for The Washington Post. Thank you for tuning in to First Look on Washington Post Live.